So the lecture I'm going to talk in this lecture is basically the relationship of language and logic, symbolic logic. The anchor or the reference point being in continuation of how the Russellian way of looking at arithmetics, mathematics vis-a-vis logic. So in that line, I would rather like to connect the same thing with how the linguistic part of it, the the language part of it, how language and logic, how they interface with each other, or rather how logic or symbolic logic, as it was developing in the earlier part of 19th century, how it later interfaced with the how we construe language as such, the interface between the two. Even though as such language, the notions of language, how you understand language is very broad in the sense that the very way of saying what is word and giving meaning to words, or origin of words, and symbolization of words. So it's in itself a very broad thing, whether the words and the meanings and the relationship between them, whether it exists, maybe it is there, or in the evolution of human history, humans, the language has evolved maybe in the evolutionary Darwinian sense or not, where there are viewpoints either ways. So if initially people are saying, if there initially there was when there was nothing, God created word, or word ex nihilo, the very way of symbolizing anything with a particular construct, a cognitive construct, which gives meaning to the word. So it is also very wide. It's also uh, the debate will maybe it will go bit vast. It will go in some another direction. So what I would rather like to try to connect is how Bertrand Russell has tried to how not Bertrand Russell in his various doctrines of logical atomism, his uh, uh, his theory of on descriptions, his theory of types, and his famous paper on denoting. So these very things, these very invocations or innovations, or what I should say, uh, innovations, or which Russell invented, uh, were very much they somehow in a sense were significant in trying to how we construed the the language, how we construct language as such evolved. So before I'm going to start it, for example, so what I'll just quote, for example, some of the for example, in inquiry into meaning and truth, there are some good passages, for example, which I'll just quote. For example, Russell says, "We think that the grass is green, the stones are hard, and the snow is cold. But physics assures us that the greenness of grass, the hardness of stones, and the coldness of snow are not the greenness, hardness, and coldness that we know in our experience, but something very different. The observer, when he sees to himself to be observing stone, is really, if physics is to be believed, observes effects of stone upon himself. Logicians have reduced the necessary premises to very large number of highly abstract propositions, which are difficult to understand and which the logicians themselves only believe to because they are found to be logically equivalent to large number of more familiar propositions. So the fact that mathematics can be deduced from premises is emphatically not reason for a belief. So, so here he wants to say that the symbolization of meaning, when we go from when we in the language of sciences, theoretical sciences, the very way, for example, how we characterize what is the relationship between pure mathematics and theoretical physics. Theoretical physics is and experimental physics, or different branches of knowledge. So the way how we the mathematicians ways of or logicians ways of characterizing uh, how he gives me how he constructs a language to represent these abstractions may not be necessarily the way we normally as a part of human what I should experientiality experience certain properties. So when a logicist or an or a physicist or an so when he symbolizes certain characteristics, or when he formalizes a language, so that so there is some difference, which makes things maybe complicated or maybe simple, or not say rather crisp and simple, or maybe to the people, or to the users of that very field. So in this case, our interest is how language and logic, how they are related. And language has maybe, for example, it's a very how you construct a language in the wider sense. And in the linguistic sense, how we are the syntactical and the semantical aspects of language, how they are constructed, and uh, how later how the logicians understanding of language and how the grammatical understanding of language may sometimes intersect or diverge, starting from these assumptions. For example, so there is one important thing in the construction of this uh, thing is, if I have also in my previous lectures also talked of something called subject and predicate, and the predicativity of a subject is a sort of inference which is due to the adjectivity which is associated with the subject. So how, for example, the relations, how, for example, um so how these things, how, for example, uh, go on in the making of our, for example, uh, when we talk of what is a proposition or what's a sentence, or what's a word. If we start with a word, and word, the invocation of word, a word leads to the formation of sentences. And sentences can be of various, there can be logical sentences, there cannot be logical sentences. And what is the way in the Russellian sense? So we have used the word, there is a word called propositions. So so maybe a proposition may, for example, it may be, although it may be true, we can see no way of obtaining either evidence for or against it. It involves also partial abandonment of complete. It involves also partial abandonment of complete metaphysical agnosticism that is viewed by logical pulse. We shall have to admit. So what, for example, so I'll just bit. I'll just come back to what is word, for example. So before I coming to propositions, before coming to sentences, we will come back to bit of word. For example, what for example, in the beginning was the word. This view was underlies the philosophy of which I start of the lecture said was the philosophy of Plato and Carnap, and more of the most immediate metaphysicians. It's obviously with such words that explanations of reasoning must begin. For meaning like truth and falsehood has a hierarchy of meanings corresponding to the hierarchy of languages. So, for example, a child hears a word red when an association has been established between hard word and the color red. So he has mastered the spoken word red, and if he sees something red, he is able to say red. The symbolization of word with a particular meaning uh, starts with a particular property, and whether those how and how we construct sentences for it. So to say that it has an, if sentences contain object words, what they assert depends upon the meaning of object word. So from words we get sentences. Words are containing important no object words, and from sentences we have something called syntax. We have parts of speech, and maybe so what I want to very emphasize very maybe in the logic of in logic and knowledge, maybe there are very sentences, for example what Russell wants to convey. For example, when he says that for example when he says that so